Hi there, welcome back to IndyCar on the 4th of January. Now, I'm sorry, first of all, that I've not been on the air a little bit more frequently than I have, but, there's a few things going on at the moment in the news that are worth reporting, and then there's an awful lot of stuff which just isn't worth reporting on. But I thought today I would look at the specifics of the next general election. Now, the British media has been wishing for this general election for ages, because there is nothing that the BBC and ITV love more than all the nonsense which goes with campaigning for a general election. But I think they may be disappointed if they think there's going to be one in May, because that seems to be the general consensus of opinion within the mainstream media. But I suspect that the Tory party is going to do one of two things. One, it may hang on as long as possible, since Sunak is struggling to move his poll ratings in any meaningful way at the moment. And possibly, two, another challenger for the Tory leadership may come along who will basically stab Sunak in the back and replace him prior to the general election, providing perhaps a more combative figure for the Tory party to lead them into the next general election. The polls look fairly depressing for the Tories because the Labour Party still appears to be out in front, which I guess is not really surprising considering they seem to be led by a Tory. Much has been made actually of the fact that Sir Keir Starmer, contrary to just about everyone else in the Labour Party, appears to be of the opinion that all of the most recent Tory policies regarding everything from immigration to energy cannot be reversed by the Labour Party, or he won't reverse them. So we're stuck with the idea of putting poor refugees, potential asylum seekers on some desert island somewhere waiting for their claims for asylum to be processed, or having their cases heard and then being told that they have a week to find somewhere to live. Now, this is something which I noticed yesterday in the news, that the Home Office had suddenly changed the time frame for asylum seekers whose cases were successful and had leave to continue to stay in the United Kingdom, that they were normally given several weeks to find new accommodation. But recently the Home Office decided to change that and make it just 7 days. Now, anyone who's ever tried to move house, or even just simply to find new rented accommodation, will know that it takes far longer than a week to find anything at all. And if you're a poor asylum seeker who's not been able to work, hasn't got any money, and is looking for work, it's going to be impossible for them to find any kind of accommodation in that time frame. Now, the outcry was so bad that the Home Office decided not to implement this new policy. So there is a temporary moratorium on it to enable successful asylum seekers to have a bit longer to find accommodation. But this is typical of the type of policy which Sir Keir Starmer is unlikely to undo or to repeal. So the Labour Party is being led by a Tory, and nobody in the Labour Party seems to really have thought about perhaps changing the leadership for somebody a bit more socialist, so we say, which would be expected from a Labour politician. However, Keir Starmer is obviously desperately worried about losing the votes of potential swing voters in the south of England who have up until recently been voting Tory and now regret it. And he's looking for them to swing to Labour, and the only way for him to get that, according to Mr Starmer, is basically to ape the policies of the Tory party. So when it comes to a general election, I suspect that the Tories are going to hang on, at least Sunak is going to try and hang on till the bitter end, and it's possible, although unlikely, that the general election could be held as late as January 2025. Now, January 2025, or the winter of 2024-25, would be a terrible time to be having a general election, and nobody expects that the Tory party would want to run an election through the Christmas and New Year holiday period. So I think that is unlikely, but I also think a May general election is also very unlikely. However, what does the general election hold for the people of Scotland? Well, I think, like everything else in the United Kingdom's two-party system, there's only a choice of two parties. even in Scotland, there's only a choice of two parties. It's either going to be the SNP or Labour. The Tories seem to be a distant third or even fourth in many places. Liberal Democrats barely even showing up in the statistics. And the Greens, well, they've virtually vanished off the polling statistics completely. So that leaves the SNP pretty much twice the number of votes forecast in the polls as the Labour Party, which should, according to the polls, if they were repeated in a general election, give a majority or a seat number to the SNP of at least 48, possibly even 50 seats out of a potential 59. So it looks as though, unless the SNP does something absolutely ridiculously stupid, and let's face it, they have done a few of those things over the years, unless they do something really daft to torpedo their chances of winning, there's a good chance that they'll win the highest number of seats, and that would be a seat majority. Now, a seat majority is not a majority of votes cast, it's just a majority of the number of seats won, and basically the party that wins the most seats is the successful party in terms of a general election in the UK system of first past the post. So that would mean that, technically speaking, the SNP would have won the general election, but they wouldn't have had 50% or more of the vote. And that is kind of critical, because if you want the country to be free from the United Kingdom, if you wanted to repeal the Acts of Union, you would need at least slightly more than half of the Scottish electorate voting in a general election to vote for pro-independence parties. And those parties would need to say, all three of them, that in the event of a vote majority, that they would simply end the union, and that would be that. Except that none of them is actually doing that. The SNP is saying that a seat majority would trigger some kind of negotiation with the United Kingdom, but they're not really all that specific about what that would be. And then again, the United Kingdom is not going to want to negotiate with the SNP, no matter how many seats they win. And then there's the ALBA offering, which is slightly similar, but at least with ALBA they went as far as to say that it would be a vote majority that would trigger any kind of move towards independence. But again, they are looking at the transfer of powers, in other words, negotiating for Holyrood to have the powers to hold yet another referendum. Now, referendums, to be fair, are not normally the way in which any country becomes independent of the United Kingdom. In fact, I don't think there have been, I may be corrected on this, but I don't think any of the 65 or thereabouts nations which have actually left the United Kingdom or the Commonwealth or whatever you want to call it nowadays have ever actually done so using a referendum. So it's not normal to do referendums. However, if you have a general election in which one or more parties are pro-independence and there is a majority of voters who vote for those parties, not necessarily all one party, but if you take all of the votes and count them together, if there is 50% plus one vote, then that is a vote majority, and that, under any form of democracy, means that that is the winning proposition. And if the proposition is independence, then all you have to do then is declare the union over, repeal the Scottish Acts of Union, which are the only laws in Scotland which keep the union in place, and that's the end of it. But at the moment, no one seems to be prepared to say that, which is a pity, really. And then we have all of the unionist trolls out in force at the moment on the pages of social media, claiming that Westminster is sovereign over Scotland and that we haven't a chance, we can't break free because we're just puny Scotland and Westminster holds all the cards and we can't do anything about it. However, sovereignty, the sovereignty of the Scottish people, also known as popular sovereignty, was never absolutely abolished by Westminster, even after the Union, because they didn't think it was necessary. They had completed this treaty under the threat of invasion, plus a national blockade of shipping which prevented Scotland from importing or exporting anything and caused the collapse of its new colony at Darien in Panama back in the day. But that union, which was supposedly signed in 1707 on behalf of Scotland by some nobles and wealthy landowners who were either bribed or coerced into doing so, never mentioned in any of its articles that the sovereignty of the people of Scotland was to be swept away and Westminster sovereignty would replace it. It was just assumed that because the Treaty of Union created a new country called Great Britain, that was the end of it, and that the Scots would simply be invited to have a few MPs whose purpose in Westminster was largely there to be laughed at, mocked and humiliated by the English MPs. And to be fair, that's pretty much what's been going on for the last 300 and something years. Mocking, humiliation on a daily basis. So the next general election is likely to provide more of the same. However, one of the other things which these unionist trolls are constantly carping on about is the fact that Britain owns all of Scotland's resources. In other words, Westminster owns the right to exploit our resources. But it's worth pointing out to any unionist who comes on these channels and starts complaining that we've got no right to our own oil or our own gas or our own wind energy or anything else, that there is nothing in the Treaty of Union which transfers the ownership of Scottish resources to England. It was left out of the treaty. If you read the treaty itself or you read the Articles of Union, you'll see lots of rules about the taxation of wool, of sheep, of mutton, of meat, of fish, of drink, of alcohol. It's all about taxation, or it's about Scotland repaying England's massive war debts for all the various wars it was fighting at the time. And that, incidentally, has remained in force ever since. We are responsible for a huge proportion of English debt because of the Union Treaty. But that's really the only thing that it commits us to, the taxation and these repayments of English debt, or the servicing of English debts. But nothing in the treaty deals with our natural resources. It doesn't deal with whisky, it doesn't deal with water, wind, tidal energy, oil or gas. None of those things were transferred in ownership to the London authorities or Westminster or the Crown. And remember that all of the seabed and all the resources in the seabed around Scotland are the property of the Scottish Crown, not the English Crown. Remember, the crowns were combined, but the Scottish Crown wasn't abolished either. Again, the English were so arrogant and they thought they didn't need to do that because they basically combined the two crowns and felt that that was enough. However, the Scottish Crown remains as it always was, not vested in a parliament and not vested in a monarch, but vested in what's known as the community of the realm. In other words, you and me, the voters, the people of Scotland. And that has remained intact all the way through the Union and continues to this day, no matter what any unionists tell you. So I guess the message for today, and I hope it's a message of hope, is that when we do decide to have another general election, and I don't think the one coming up this year is going to be the one to do it, but when we have perhaps the next Scottish general election, if there is a majority of people vote for independence parties of any colour, and when you add up all of the votes in both the first and the second choice parts of the election system in the Scottish Parliament, if pro-independence parties have more than 50% of the vote in that parliamentary election, then we should be able to repeal the Acts of Union. And if our politicians refuse to do so and squawk on about having negotiations with England, it's actually up to the people to decide to put pressure on the politicians, to demand that we end the Union. Since we've already voted in a majority of voters to end the Union, then that is exactly what should happen. The Union should be repealed. The acts that hold it in place in Scots law should be repealed and it should be abolished. Just remember that the Holyrood Parliament is basically a British Parliament. It is the British Parliament's branch office, if you like, in Scotland. The fact that the SNP is the largest party in it is an indication of the strength of feeling that the people of Scotland do want to be independent, but the system that's been set up to allow them to vote for MSPs is so heavily gerrymandered to make sure that unionists are in that parliament in large numbers that it's very difficult in terms of seat counts to win anything at all in that system. However, vote count is a very different thing, and it is the votes that matter, and it's the number of people who want independence and can be demonstrated in any general election in either Scotland or the whole UK over the next few years that should trigger the repeal of the Acts of Union. However, we need to remember that it is the people themselves, after such an event, who need to get out on the streets. They need to shut down Holyrood until our own parliamentarians repeal those acts. We need to actually take to the streets to demand it, because I am pretty certain that all of the MSPs in that parliament, no matter how pro-independence they might be, are legally constrained by the oaths they took when they became MSPs to protect the union at all costs. And they can't be trusted to take the right sort of action without a great deal of public uproar, public demonstrations, people taking to the streets, people shutting down the parliament and blockading it and not allowing it to function until these politicians do what they're meant to do. It is going to cause uproar, but it is the only way of getting the powers back that we want and getting our independence back, so that we can deal with the rest of the world as a normal country and not as some kind of pet of Westminster. Anyway, that is it from me today. I hope you find this a little bit more uplifting than my last couple of programmes. What I'm trying to say to you here is that no matter whether you trust our politicians or not, if we, the people, vote in majority for independence parties at any general election, then the people have spoken. And under the rules of democracy, we can demand that that union treaty be repealed, and we can organise whatever we like. We can organise a national strike. We can have the entire streets around the Parliament in Edinburgh blocked for months, if necessary, in order to force our parliamentarians to take the action required. So there are interesting times ahead. If we do get a vote count majority, then basically the gloves come off and the rules change, because when you've got a vote majority, that's democracy. And when democracy has been served and it's been seen and publicly counted, and there are more people wanting independence than those who don't, then it's independence that is won, and it's independence that the people must demand, whether the politicians want to do it or not. That's it from me today. I will see you again perhaps over the weekend, perhaps on Sunday, I think, by the looks of things at the moment. It's a busy time for me just now, getting business back on the road, as it were, and basically refilling my diary with appointments. So apologies for being absent for so long. I'll be back again. I hope you've enjoyed today's programme and you stayed till the end. Remember that you can still donate to my PayPal account if you want to. I thank everyone who continues to support the channel with small donations. That is what keeps this happening, and I will continue for as long as I'm needed. So I'll see you soon. Keep the faith, and remember, it's the voters that count and the number of votes that count. It's nothing to do with the politicians. It's nothing to do with the parliaments. It's to do with us, the people. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.